At 9:13 in the morning on July 6, 1944, test pilot Heini Dittmar climbed into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet at Peenemünde test facility in northern Germany. The aircraft sitting on the runway weighed barely 4,000 pounds. It had no landing gear, just a wheeled dolly it would drop after takeoff. It carried enough rocket fuel for exactly 7 minutes of powered flight, and if everything went according to plan, Dittmar was about to fly faster than any human being had ever flown before. The morning was clear, with light winds, perfect conditions for a speed record attempt. Dittmar had flown this aircraft before, but never at full power, never pushing it to the absolute edge of its performance envelope. Today was different. The engineers had calculated every variable. They knew the theoretical maximum speed. They knew the stresses the airframe could handle. But theory and reality do not always match, especially at speeds no aircraft had ever reached. The engineers standing near the runway knew this test could kill him. The Me 163 had already killed multiple pilots during development. The rocket fuel was so volatile it could dissolve human flesh on contact. The aircraft had no ejection seat. If something went wrong at high speed, Dittmar would have seconds to react before the aircraft disintegrated around him. But speed was everything now. It was 1944. Germany was losing the war. Allied bombers filled German skies every day, protected by fighters that German pilots could no longer match. The Luftwaffe needed something revolutionary, something that could reach bomber formations before Allied escorts could intercept, something faster than anything the Americans or British flew. The Me 163 was that something. Rocket-powered, tailless, designed by glider engineer Alexander Lippisch. On paper, it was the future of aviation. In practice, it was killing German pilots faster than it was killing Allied bombers. Dittmar had been testing versions of this aircraft since 1941. On October 2, 1941, he had set a world speed record of 1,004.5 kilometers per hour in an earlier prototype. That flight had been extraordinary in its own right. Dittmar had taken off from Peenemünde in the Me 163 AV4, an unpowered glider that would be towed to altitude by a Messerschmitt Bf 110. At 3,000 meters, he released from the tow plane. The Walter rocket motor ignited. The acceleration was unlike anything any pilot had experienced. Within seconds, Dittmar was traveling faster than any propeller-driven fighter could hope to achieve. He pushed the aircraft to 1,004.5 kilometers per hour in level flight, becoming the first human to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour. The flight lasted only a few minutes before the fuel ran out, but it proved that rocket propulsion could achieve speeds impossible for conventional aircraft. But that record was set in level flight with an older, less powerful engine. The Me 163A had been a proof of concept, demonstrating that rocket-powered flight was feasible. Today's test was different. Today, Dittmar would push the Me 163 BV-18 to its absolute limit. The aircraft had been modified with a new dual-chamber, Walter HWK 509A rocket motor. More power, more thrust, more speed. The engineers estimated it could reach 1,100 kilometers per hour. That was 700 miles per hour. Nothing with wings had ever moved that fast. At 9:16, Dittmar signaled he was ready. The ground crew stepped back. The rocket motor ignited. A geyser of flame erupted from the tail. The Me 163 rolled forward, accelerated faster than any aircraft Dittmar had ever flown, and lifted off the runway. The wheeled dolly fell away. For the next 3 minutes, Dittmar climbed straight up, at an angle that would have stalled any conventional fighter. The Me 163 climbed like a missile. 6,000 meters, 8,000 meters, 10,000 meters. At 12,000 meters, Dittmar leveled off and pushed the throttle to maximum. The rocket motor roared. The aircraft surged forward. The airspeed indicator climbed past 1,000 kilometers per hour, 1,050, 1,100, 1,130 kilometers per hour, 702 miles per hour. Then Dittmar felt the aircraft shudder. The rudder surface began to flutter. At that speed, at that altitude, Aerodynamic forces were tearing the tail apart. Dittmar cut the engine immediately. The rocket motor shut down. Suddenly the cockpit was silent except for the wind screaming past the canopy. He was gliding now. No power, no way to restart the engine, 12,000 meters above northern Germany, with most of his vertical rudder about to separate from the airframe. Dittmar had 8 minutes to get the aircraft back to the ground before he ran out of sky. He nosed down gently, bleeding off speed, trying not to put more stress on the damaged rudder. The Me 163 glided like the sailplane it essentially was. Dittmar had started his career as a glider pilot. He knew how to handle an unpowered aircraft, but he had never glided an aircraft that was structurally failing at high altitude. He descended through 8,000 meters, 6,000, 4,000. The runway at Peenemünde came into view. Dittmar lined up for landing approach. The Me 163 had no landing gear. It landed on a retractable skid under the fuselage. One chance to get it right. Hit too hard and the aircraft would cartwheel. Come in too shallow and he would overshoot the runway. At 300 meters altitude, Dittmar committed to the approach. The aircraft dropped toward the runway. The ground rushed up. At the last second, Dittmar pulled back on the stick. The Me 163 flared. The skid touched concrete. The aircraft skidded down the runway, trailing sparks. When it finally stopped, Dittmar was alive. The Me 163 was damaged but intact. And Heini Dittmar had just set an unofficial world speed record that would stand unmatched for 3 years. 702 miles per hour. The engineers who examined the aircraft after landing found that nearly the entire vertical rudder surface had broken away from flutter during the high-speed run. A few more seconds at maximum speed, and the aircraft would have come apart in the air. Dittmar had reached the absolute edge of what was aerodynamically possible in 1944. But here was the cruel irony. The Me 163 Komet, the fastest aircraft in the world, was almost completely useless as a fighter. The path to this moment had been long and difficult. Alexander Lippisch had begun designing tailless aircraft in the 1920s, experimenting with radical wing configurations that conventional engineers dismissed as impractical. But Lippisch understood aerodynamics in ways others did not. He knew that a tailless design could be more efficient, could reduce drag, could achieve speeds impossible for conventional aircraft. When the German Air Ministry began looking for revolutionary fighter concepts in the late 1930s, Lippisch proposed a rocket-powered tailless interceptor. The concept was radical. No propeller, no tail, powered by volatile chemicals that ignited on contact. Most engineers thought it was suicide. But Germany was preparing for war, and revolutionary ideas were being given chances they would never receive in peacetime. Development began in earnest in 1940. The first prototypes were unpowered gliders, testing the aerodynamic concept. Pilots reported that the aircraft handled unlike anything they had flown. The controls were sensitive. The aircraft wanted to climb. Everything about it felt unnatural. But it flew, and it flew well once pilots adapted to its characteristics. Then came the powered versions with the Walter rocket motor. The acceleration was extraordinary, but the danger was equally extreme. Test pilots were killed. Aircraft exploded on the ground during fueling. The hypergolic fuel mixture, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was so corrosive and reactive that ground crews wore protective suits. One spill could kill a man in minutes. Between May 1944 and May 1945, approximately 370 Me 163 aircraft were built. They were deployed to Jägerschwader 400, a fighter unit specifically created to operate the Komet. The unit was based at Brandis Airfield near Leipzig, positioned to intercept American bomber formations attacking targets in central Germany. In 11 months of combat operations, Me 163 pilots achieved 9 confirmed kills against Allied aircraft, though German records claim as many as 16. Even taking the higher claim, 16 kills in 11 months from a unit equipped with the fastest aircraft ever built. That is a failure by any measure. And it was not because German pilots did not know how to fly the Me 163. It was because the aircraft's incredible speed was also its fatal weakness. The Me-163 could reach 39,000 feet in 3.5 minutes. No Allied fighter could climb that fast. Once at altitude, it could dive through bomber formations at speeds no gunner could track. But the rocket motor only provided 7.5 minutes of powered flight. After 1 or 2 attack passes, the pilot had to glide back to base with no ability to maneuver, no way to escape if Allied fighters spotted him. Allied pilots quickly learned to simply wait until the Me-163 ran out of fuel, then attack it during its unpowered glide back to the airfield. American fighter pilots developed specific tactics for dealing with the Komet. They would orbit above Me-163 bases at high altitude, watching for the telltale rocket exhaust plume during launch. Once a Komet attacked and its engine cut out, the Americans would dive on the defenseless glider. Some Me-163 pilots were shot down within sight of their own runways, gliding home with empty fuel tanks and no way to defend themselves. The aircraft that could outrun anything in the sky became easy prey the moment its engine stopped. And even when the Me-163 had fuel, its speed created problems. The aircraft carried 2 30mm cannons. At 700 miles per hour, a pilot had less than 2 seconds to acquire a target, aim, and fire before overshooting. Most bomber crews never even knew they had been attacked. The Me-163 would flash past them so fast their gunners could not track it. But the Me-163 pilot usually missed too, because aiming at that speed required reflexes faster than human biology allowed. German engineers tried to solve this problem. They developed the Jagdfaust, an upward-firing weapon system with 6 50mm recoilless mortars mounted in the wing roots. The idea was that a Komet pilot could fly directly underneath a bomber formation. Photoelectric cells would detect the bomber's shadow and automatically fire the mortars upward. The pilot would not have to aim at all. The system was tested, and it apparently destroyed at least 1 Lancaster bomber. But the Jagdfaust was never widely deployed. Most Me-163 pilots had to rely on their 2 30mm cannons, trying to hit bombers while flying faster than racing cars travel today. Feldwebel Siegfried Schubert was the most successful Me-163 pilot. He shot down 3 Allied bombers. His first confirmed kill came on August 16, 1944, when he attacked a formation of B-17s. Schubert climbed to altitude in his Me-163, positioned himself above the bomber formation, and dove through them at maximum speed. He fired a short burst from his 30mm cannons as he passed a B-17. The rounds hit the bomber's wing root. The wing folded. The B-17 fell out of formation. Schubert's second and third victories came on August 24, 1944, during a single mission. He attacked another B-17 formation, destroyed 1 bomber on his first pass, climbed back to altitude on rocket power, and dove through the formation again. His second victim fell trailing smoke. 3 kills in 9 days of operations. Schubert managed to line up his shots despite the incredible closing speed, fired short bursts from his 30mm cannons, and hit his targets. Then, on October 7, 1944, Schubert was killed when his Me-163 exploded during takeoff. The volatile rocket fuel claimed another pilot. His 3 victories represented the most successful combat record of any Komet pilot. Other experienced pilots scored 1 or 2 victories. Most never hit anything. The problem was not the pilot. The problem was that speed without control is just speed. You cannot fight if you cannot aim. Meanwhile, the Me-163 was killing its own pilots. Numerous German pilots died during training and testing. The rocket fuel, a mixture of T-Stoff and C-Stoff, was hypergolic. The 2 chemicals ignited spontaneously when they came in contact. That made the rocket motor reliable. It also made refueling incredibly dangerous. Ground crews wore protective suits. The fuel tanks had to be filled separately to prevent accidental mixing. If a fuel line ruptured on landing, which happened frequently given the aircraft's high landing speed and skid landing gear, the chemicals could leak into the cockpit. In one documented case, Oberleutnant Josef Pose was killed on December 30, 1943, when a fuel line ruptured during takeoff at Bad Zwischenahn. Pose was conducting a test flight in an ME 163 prototype. The wheeled takeoff dolly struck the runway during liftoff and bounced back up into the aircraft's fuselage. The impact ruptured a T-STOF fuel line. The leaking T-STOF, a highly corrosive hydrogen peroxide oxidizer, began dissolving Pose's body before rescuers could reach him. Witnesses reported that his right arm had been dissolved to nothing. The other arm and his head were little more than masses of soft tissue. The chemical had eaten through flesh and muscle in minutes. It was one of the most horrific deaths in aviation history, and it illustrated the extreme danger of the Me 163's fuel system. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe abandoned the Me 163 in favor of the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me 262 was slower than the Komet, but it had 30 minutes of powered flight instead of 7 minutes. It had retractable landing gear. It did not require handling hypergolic rocket fuel, and it could actually shoot down Allied aircraft in meaningful numbers. When the war ended in May 1945, most Me 163 aircraft were sitting on airfields with no fuel, no pilots, and no mission. The fastest aircraft in World War II was also the most spectacular failure. But while German engineers were building rocket-powered interceptors that flew too fast to aim, American engineers were solving a different problem. They were building a fighter that was fast enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, maneuverable enough to dogfight German fighters over their own territory, and reliable enough that pilots actually survived long enough to become aces. The American bomber offensive against Germany had begun in earnest in 1943. The strategy was simple in concept but brutal in execution. Heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, would fly deep into Germany in broad daylight and destroy industrial targets. The bombers flew in tight formations for mutual defensive fire. Each aircraft bristled with 50-caliber machine guns. Gunners were trained to create interlocking fields of fire that would shred any fighter that tried to attack. In theory, the bomber formations were flying fortresses that could defend themselves. In practice, they were dying in appalling numbers. The problem was range. American fighters could escort the bombers part of the way into Germany, but they could not go all the way to the targets and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter in 1943, had a combat radius of about 230 miles. That was enough to reach targets in Western Germany, but not deep into the Reich. Once the escorts turned back, German fighters would swarm the unprotected bomber formations. The B-17s and B-24s had defensive armament, but it was not enough. German fighters would attack from head-on, exploiting the bombers' weakest defensive position. They would coordinate attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the gunners. They would use heavy cannon that could destroy a bomber with a few hits. In the second half of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing 5 to 7% of the bombers on every mission. That does not sound like much until you do the math. A bomber crew had to fly 30 missions to complete their tour. If every mission had a 5% loss rate, the statistical probability of surviving 30 missions was 21%. Most bomber crews did not come home. The psychological impact was devastating. Crews would wake up, eat breakfast, attend mission briefings, and climb into their aircraft, knowing they probably would not survive the war. Some men broke down before ever reaching Germany. Others flew their missions mechanically, emotionally numb, waiting for death. The losses were staggering. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s out of 291 dispatched, 20% losses in one day. The target was ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production. The mission planners knew it would be costly, but they believed destroying the factories would cripple German industry. The bombers flew without fighter escort for most of the mission. German fighters attacked in waves. Bf-109s and F-190s tore into the formations. Some bombers were hit so many times they simply disintegrated in mid-air. Others limped back to England on 2 engines, trailing smoke, with dead and wounded crew members inside. When the survivors landed at their bases in England, they climbed out of their aircraft and found empty bunks where their friends had slept the night before. Entire crews were gone. Some had been shot down over Germany. Others had crashed into the English Channel trying to make it home. The debriefing rooms were quiet. Men sat, in shock, unable to process what they had seen. Some crews refused to fly after Schweinfurt. The psychological toll was almost as devastating as the physical losses. American commanders knew they could not sustain those casualty rates. Something had to change. That something was the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft had been designed as a private venture by North American Aviation in 1940. The British Royal Air Force ordered the first production models and deployed them in 1942. But the early P-51s had a problem. They were fast and maneuverable at low altitude, but their Allison engines lost power above 15,000 feet. That made them unsuitable for bomber escort missions, which were flown at 25,000 feet or higher. The aircraft seemed destined to remain a low-altitude tactical fighter, useful for ground attack but not for air superiority. Then someone had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a British Rolls-Royce? Merlin? The Merlin was a supercharged engine that actually gained power at high altitude. It was already powering Spitfires and Hurricanes with great success. North American Aviation obtained a license to build the Merlin in the United States as the Packard V-1650. They installed it in the P-51 airframe. The result was extraordinary. The P-51D Mustang combined American airframe design with British engine technology. It was fast at all altitudes. It was maneuverable. And most importantly, it had range. With external drop tanks, a P-51D could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,300 miles, and still have fuel left to fight when it got there. Starting in early 1944, Mustangs began escorting bombers all the way to targets in Germany. German fighters that had spent months attacking undefended bomber formations suddenly found themselves fighting American fighters over their own airfields. The tactical situation reversed completely. German pilots who had once hunted bombers with impunity now had to fight for their lives. The bomber loss rate dropped to 2%, then 1%. By mid-1944, American bombers were attacking Berlin in daylight with fewer losses than they had suffered attacking targets in France a year earlier. The Mustang made that possible. On October 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Chuck Yeager was flying a P-51D Mustang he had named Glamorous Glen II over northwestern Germany. Yeager was 21 years old, from Hamlin, West Virginia, and he had already been shot down once, evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, made his way to Spain, and talked his way back into combat against regulations that prohibited evaders from flying over enemy territory again. He was escorting B-17 bombers on a raid near Bremen. His squadron of 16 Mustangs was flying at 25,000 feet when Yeager spotted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters below. He counted 22 of them. The German fighters had not seen the Mustangs yet. Yeager and his squadron circled into position and attacked out of the Sunday. What happened next became one of the most famous dogfights of the war. As Yeager maneuvered his P-51 to fire at a trailing Bf-109, the German fighter suddenly turned left and collided with his wingman. Both German pilots bailed out. 2 victories without firing a shot. Then the sky erupted into a wild turning dogfight. Bf-109s and P-51s spinning and diving in every direction. Yeager spotted another Bf-109 and fired from 600 yards. The German fighter exploded. His third victory. Another Bf-109 came at him from behind. Yeager reversed, got on the German pilot's tail, and fired again. Another kill, his fourth. By now the dogfight had descended from 25,000 feet to 15,000 feet. German pilots were trying to escape. Yeager spotted a 5th Bf-109 trying to break away. He chased it down and destroyed it. 5 enemy aircraft in one mission. Yeager became an ace in a day. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Yeager's squadron had destroyed 8 of the 22 German fighters without losing a single Mustang. It was the kind of lopsided victory that would have been impossible a year earlier. The P-51 gave American pilots the tools they needed to dominate German airspace. Jaeger landed back at his base with 587 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition expended, and not a single bullet hole in his aircraft. The P-51D had done exactly what it was designed to do, fast enough to catch German fighters, maneuverable enough to win dogfights, reliable enough to bring Jaeger home alive. His combat report documented the engagement in precise detail. Aircraft serial number, altitude, ammunition, expended, enemy aircraft types, witnesses. The bureaucracy of air combat required detailed records, but behind those numbers were life and death moments at 300 miles per hour. The P-51D Mustang was not the fastest fighter in World War II. Its maximum speed was 440 miles per hour, far slower than the Me 163 Komet at 700 miles per hour, or even the Me 262 jet at 540 miles per hour. But the Mustang had something more important than raw speed. It had range. A P-51D could fly from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of more than 1,300 miles, and still have fuel left to fight when it got there. No other fighter in the world could do that in 1944. German fighters were faster. British Spitfires were more maneuverable at low altitude. Soviet Yaks climbed faster, but the Mustang could go farther than any of them, and that made all the difference. The difference was dramatic. In October 1943, before P-51 escorts became widespread, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single week during raids on Schweinfurt. Entire bomber groups were decimated. Crews watched their friends' aircraft explode around them. The loss rate was unsustainable. By contrast, in March 1945, with full P-51 escort coverage, the 8th Air Force flew over 1,000 bomber sorties in a single day with minimal losses. That transformation happened because one aircraft could go far enough. The P-51D was powered by a Packard 5 1650 Merlin engine, a license-built version of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin. The engine produced 1,490 horsepower at sea level and could sustain that power output for hours without overheating or failing. At higher altitudes, with the two-stage supercharger engaged, the engine actually produced more power. The supercharger compressed incoming air, compensating for the thinner atmosphere at altitude. This meant the P-51 was most effective between 20,000 and 30,000 feet, exactly where bomber formations flew and where German interceptors had to climb to attack them. Compare that to the Me 262 jet, which used two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines that produced 1,900 pounds of thrust each. The jets were revolutionary technology, but they had severe limitations. The engines had a service life of only 10 to 25 hours before they needed to be replaced. German maintenance crews were constantly swapping out failed engines. The turbine blades were made of low-grade steel alloys because Germany lacked access to heat-resistant materials. The blades would warp and fail. Fuel consumption was enormous. An E-262 burned fuel 4 times faster than a P-51. Or consider the Me 163 rocket motor, which produced 3,300 pounds of thrust for 7.5 minutes, and then you were gliding. The P-51's engine was not the most powerful, but it was reliable. Pilots could trust it to get them home. The Mustang was not particularly innovative in its design. It had a conventional layout, a liquid-cooled engine, a laminar flow wing that reduced drag, and 650 caliber machine guns. The laminar flow wing was the most advanced feature. Traditional wings had turbulent airflow over their surfaces, creating drag. The P-51's wing was designed so air flowed smoothly over the surface with minimal turbulence. This reduced drag significantly, improving both speed and range. The design required precise manufacturing tolerances, but North American Aviation mastered the technique. What made the P-51 exceptional was that everything worked together. The laminar flow wing gave it range. The Merlin engine gave it power at high altitude where the fighting happened. The bubble canopy gave the pilot visibility in all directions, crucial for spotting enemy fighters before they spotted you. The 6 machine guns gave it firepower. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. With all 6 guns firing, a P-51 could put 300 pounds of metal into a target in 10 seconds. That was enough to destroy any fighter or bomber. It was not the best at any single thing. German F4U 190 fighters had heavier armament, with 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. British Spitfires had better low-altitude maneuverability and could turn inside a Mustang below 10,000 feet. Soviet Yak fighters had superior climb rates and could reach altitude faster. But the Mustang was good enough at everything that mattered. It could fly high, fly far, fight hard, and bring pilots home. Sometimes good enough everywhere is better than excellent in one area and terrible in others. Chuck Yeager flew 64 combat missions in P-51 Mustangs. He shot down 11.5 enemy aircraft. The Towsand in P-51. Half credit came from sharing a kill with another pilot. He also shot down one Mi-262 jet, one of the few American pilots to score a jet kill during the war. That kill came on November 6, 1944, near Aachen airfield in Germany. Yeager was leading a flight of P-51s when he spotted Mi-262 jets attacking bomber formations above him. The jets used their speed advantage to climb away and disappeared into the clouds. Yeager could not catch them. No Allied fighter could catch an Mi-262 that wanted to run. But Yeager noticed something important. The Mi-262s had climbed into the clouds. They did not stay and fight. That meant they were either low on fuel or low on ammunition or both. And eventually, they would have to land. Yeager dropped below the clouds and started looking for Mi-262 bases. He knew the jets had to be operating from nearby airfields. Their fuel consumption was so high they could not fly far from base. He spotted one jet preparing to land at Aachen airfield. The pilot was focused on his approach, landing gear down, flaps extended, airspeed low. The Mi-262 was vulnerable. Yeager dove on him from above, building speed. He got within 400 yards and fired a burst. His rounds hit the jet's wings. The Mi-262 crashed several hundred feet short of the runway, cartwheeling across the ground. Yeager earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for that kill. What he discovered was the Mi-262's fatal weakness. It was fast in the air, but vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The Jumo 004 engines needed time to spool up to full power. During takeoff, an E-262 was accelerating but not yet fast. Allied fighters diving from altitude could catch them. During landing, the jets had to slow down, lower their landing gear, and commit to an approach. Once committed, they could not easily abort. German pilots called the final approach to landing the Valley of Death. American fighters would be waiting. After the war, Yeager became a test pilot. On October 14, 1947, he flew the Bell X-1 rocket plane past Mach 1, becoming the first person to break the sound barrier in level flight. The X-1 reached Mach 1.06 at 45,000 feet over Rogers Dry Lake in California. The flight made Yeager famous. When reporters asked him years later which aircraft was more difficult to fly, the X-1 or the P-51, Yeager said the X-1 was faster, but the Mustang was harder to keep alive in combat. The X-1 only had to go fast in a straight line. The Mustang had to go fast while people were shooting at it. Yeager understood something fundamental about aircraft design. Speed matters, but survivability matters more. The fastest aircraft in the world is worthless if it gets you killed. The P-51 was not the most glamorous fighter. It was not the most innovative, but it did its job, mission after mission, and brought pilots home. That reliability made it one of the most successful fighters in history. Meanwhile, the Germans were also building jet fighters that actually worked. The Messerschmitt Mi-262 Schwalbe entered combat in July 1944. Unlike the Mi-163 rocket fighter, the Mi-262 was a practical combat aircraft. It had retractable landing gear, a long enough flight time to complete a mission, and heavy armament that could destroy a bomber in a single pass. It was also faster than any Allied fighter. The Mi-262 had a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour. The fastest Allied fighter, the P-51 Mustang, topped out at 440 miles per hour. That 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage meant Me-262 pilots could engage Allied bombers and escape before the American escorts could react. The Me-262 was armed with four 30mm cannons. Each cannon fired explosive shells that could tear a bomber apart. A single burst from all four guns could destroy a B-17. German pilots who flew the Me-262 reported that it felt like flying in the future. The acceleration was smooth and constant, unlike piston engines that vibrated and shook. The cockpit was quiet. There was no propeller noise, just the smooth whine of the turbines. The aircraft climbed effortlessly to altitude. But the fuel consumption was enormous, and the engines were fragile. Allied commanders quickly adapted. Fighter squadrons were assigned to patrol known Me-262 bases. When a German jet took off or tried to land, American fighters would attack it at its most vulnerable moment. The Germans tried to counter this by scheduling takeoffs and landings to minimize exposure. They would launch multiple jets simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the Allied fighters with numbers. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. The Germans tried to protect their jets with heavy anti-aircraft guns around the airfields, but that just meant American fighters stayed high until a jet committed to landing approach, then dove through the flak. Between July 1944 and May 1945, German pilots claimed 542 Allied aircraft destroyed by Me-262s, though actual confirmed victories were likely lower. German record-keeping deteriorated as the war progressed, and many claims could not be verified. But the Allies shot down or destroyed on the ground more than 300 Me-262s. Given that only about 300 Me-262s were operational at any given time, that meant the Luftwaffe was losing jets almost as fast as they could build them. The tactical situation became desperate for Me-262 pilots. They had to take off through Allied fighter patrols, climb to altitude while American Mustangs tried to catch them, make their attack runs against bomber formations, then run a gauntlet of enemy fighters to get back to their bases. Even with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, the odds were against them. The jets burned through fuel quickly. Engine reliability remained poor. Many Me-262s were shot down not by enemy aircraft but by their own failing engines. Pilots would be returning from missions when an engine would flame out. Without power, the Me-262 became a glider, vulnerable to any Allied fighter in the area. The Me-262 could have been a game-changer if Germany had deployed it earlier and in larger numbers. The aircraft first flew in July 1942. If Hitler had not insisted on converting it to a fighter bomber, if the Jumo 004 engines had been more reliable, if Germany had not been desperately short of fuel by late 1944, the Me-262 might have contested Allied air superiority. But it entered service too late. By the time Me-262 units were operational in significant numbers, Germany had already lost the war in the air. Allied bombers were destroying German fuel production. Synthetic fuel plants were priority targets. Every raid reduced Germany's ability to keep aircraft flying. Without fuel, the jets could not fly. By early 1945, most Me-262s sat on airfields with empty fuel tanks. Pilots who were trained and ready to fight could not get their aircraft off the ground. Germany built approximately 1,400 Me-262s, but only about 300 ever saw combat. The rest were destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing, abandoned when fuel ran out, or captured intact when Germany surrendered. The irony is that Germany built the fastest operational fighters of World War II, the Me-163 Komet at 700 miles per hour, the Me-262 Schwalbe at 540 miles per hour, both faster than anything the Allies flew. But speed alone did not win the air war. Range mattered, reliability mattered, having enough fuel to fly your aircraft mattered. And most of all, having enough time to build and deploy your advanced aircraft before the war ended mattered. Germany ran out of time. So who was the king of speed in World War II? If you measure purely by maximum velocity, the answer is clear. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet at 702 miles per hour. No aircraft built during World War II flew faster. Heine Dittmar's record from July 6, 1944, stood until October 14, 1947, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 at 891 miles per hour. For 3 years, Dittmar held the absolute speed record, but measuring success by top speed alone misses the point. The Me 163 flew approximately 300 missions and scored 9 confirmed kills. That is a 3% success rate. The P-51 flew hundreds of thousands of missions and was credited with nearly 5,000 air-to-air victories in Europe alone. The Mustang worked, the Komet did not. If you measure by strategic impact, the answer is the P-51 Mustang. Not the fastest, but fast enough, with range that changed the entire dynamic of the air war over Europe. Before the Mustang, German fighters could attack unescorted bombers with relative impunity. After the Mustang, German fighters had to fight for their lives over their own territory. The bomber loss rate dropped from unsustainable to acceptable. American crews started surviving their tours. Germany started losing the war in the air. If you measure by technological achievement, the answer is the Me 262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter, the aircraft that showed every air force in the world what the future looked like. After World War II, every major power built jet fighters based on lessons learned from the Me 262. The American F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea used a swept-wing design inspired by captured German research. The Soviet MiG-15 used a similar approach. The British Gloucester Meteor, which also entered service in 1944, proved jets were the future, but the Me 262 proved jets could dominate in combat. Speed only matters if you can use it. The Me 163 was so fast its pilots could not aim. The Me 262 was fast enough to be effective, but vulnerable on takeoff and landing. The P-51 was slower than both, but reliable enough that pilots like Chuck Yeager could fly 64 missions and survive. Heine Dittmar survived the war. After his record-breaking flight in the Me 163, he continued test-flying rocket and jet aircraft for Germany until 1945. When the war ended, he returned to civilian life. He became a sailplane designer and competition pilot. He died in 1960 during a test flight of a powered glider of his own design near Mülheim an der Ruhr. He was 48 years old. Dittmar was a brilliant pilot who pushed aircraft to their absolute limits. His speed record stood for 3 years, an achievement that demonstrated what was aerodynamically possible in the 1940s. For 3 years, Heine Dittmar held the absolute speed record for human flight. That achievement stands regardless of the Me 163's combat failures. Chuck Yeager also survived the war. He became one of the most famous test pilots in history. He flew the X-1 past the sound barrier. He commanded fighter squadrons during the Vietnam War. He retired from the Air Force as a brigadier general in 1975. He continued flying civilian aircraft into his 90s. He died in December 2020 at age 97. When people asked Yeager what made the P-51 special, he said it was honest. It did not try to do anything it could not do. It was not the fastest or the most maneuverable or the most heavily armed, but everything on the aircraft worked the way it was supposed to work. That made it a pilot's airplane, and that is the real answer to who was king of speed in World War II. It depends on what you value. If you value absolute velocity, the Me 163 Komet was king. 702 miles per hour, faster than any fighter until jets became common in the early 1950s. If you value technological innovation, the Me 262 Schwalbe was king. The first operational jet fighter, the aircraft that changed how air forces thought about speed and combat. If you value combat effectiveness, the P-51 Mustang was king. Not the fastest, but the aircraft that won air superiority over Europe and let Allied bombers destroy Germany's ability to wage war. 50 years after World War II ended, the United States Air Force asked surviving fighter pilots from the war which aircraft they would choose if they had to fly combat missions again. Most chose the P-51 Mustang, not because it was fastest, because it brought them home. If you found this exploration of World War II's fastest fighters compelling, please like this video It helps us share these forgotten technical stories from the war. Subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft and innovations that shaped history. Each story reveals something new about how technology and combat intersected. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us which World War II fighter aircraft fascinates you most and why. Our community of aviation enthusiasts and history lovers spans the globe. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.